Buck up, Weston. It's only death, all said and done. We should have to die someday, you know. We shan't lack water, and hunger without thirst isn't too bad. As for drowning, well, a bayonet wound or cancer would be worse.
This is Pints with Jack, Season 8, Episode 16. Perelandra, Chapter 13, Deliver Us from Evil. Welcome, friends, to Pints with Jack, your favorite C.S. Lewis podcast, run at the moment by three Thulcandrians. Yes, I know you were wondering that after the last couple episodes. Andrew, David, and myself, I am still here. This season, we are once again following the adventures of Elwyn Ransom, who has been battling his nemesis, the Unman. But in today's episode, I am out of the penalty box, back in the front lineup, and we will be taking a little bit of a break from the combat. And we are going to do some philosophy. Well, gentlemen, it feels like it has been a while since, well, for me, that we've all recorded together. So it is good to be back. And I love, Andrew, the quote that you chose, because I thought the wisdom of death was one of the top three themes of Out of the Silent Planet. So it's really beautiful to see Ransom come full circle in real, not just intellectually, but experientially, because he is actually facing death truly in his mind, and there's a real chance of it. And that's usually when you see someone's true beliefs. It's one thing to say, I understand death is a beautiful thing. It's another thing to like embrace it in the moment. So it's really cool to see him come kind of full circle. I'm proud of our dear boy.
Was Matt gone? I didn't notice. Oh, wait. We were efficient and clever and, grammatically correct. Oh, no, I'm kidding.
Honestly, I missed correcting someone's grammar. So
that's true. Hey, from an Englishman to an American to a colonist, that's high praise.
Well, it's funny you should say an Englishman to a colonist, because I have submitted my application to become naturalized in the United States, and I got one of my important green pieces of paper which says that my green card is now extended for 2 years while that process goes on. And I saw in my email, because we get emails of all of the mail that's incoming, I should have my letter today arriving telling me when I'm going to be doing my interview, and I get to answer all the questions about the United States that I've been cramming.
Lovely. So, listeners, somebody sent him a Budweiser.
The best singer in the world is Taylor Swift. We love McDonald's. There are 5,280 feet in a mile, but there's no what does 10 miles mean?
Nobody knows.
Measured in minutes.
Have you seen that SNL skit?
It's my favorite. I have a dream for this country. You asked about the weights and measures.
There are 3 feet in a yard. And what are 10 yards? 10 yards.
Also, what? Canada is our next state. Greenland belongs to us. I saw a meme just last night, and instead of changing it to the Gulf of America, somebody said, hey, stay with me, the Gulf of Gondor.
Ooh, I like it.
I'm with that for sure. Well, blessings on that. Kristen and I had a busy couple of weeks, did a lot of speaking and traveling and for various groups. And in the next coming months, we are interviewing for a new call program that I've been on, runs out in June, which was planned and expected. And so looking for my next church, and that may involve a move or that may involve staying close. And I'm chatting with my bishop and with his chief of staff, and we're getting all of those things on the way. So, listeners, if you have a spare prayer, we're just asking the Holy Spirit to say exactly the same thing to everyone.
David, any announcement? Are we retiring Great Divorce versus Till We Have Faces?
No, that argument will continue in perpetuity. I think I'm going to have it on my gravestone.
In your own minds. Oh, by the way, I don't know when this is released, but I've been approached by the HarperCollins, who has the official C.S. Lewis Substack. And their March content is going to be focused on Till We Have Faces. And I've been asked to write the banner article. And so the article I'm working on to send to Harper is Far and Away Why Till We Have Faces was C.S. Lewis's best book.
Andrew doesn't quite know what I'm referring to.
Oh, no. What's going on?
Oh, no. I shared it. I shared it on the Slack. You might not have seen it though.
I didn't see it. Yeah.
I don't know if. Yeah, I doubt he did. We had a listener that didn't love our constants. He actually was like, "This is like I never like podcasts. So this is actually a compliment, but this thing is going to bug me, and if it keeps going on indefinitely, I'm going to have to stop." Was the short answer.
The funny thing is, he had endured 6 seasons, and actually, I think at about this point, we start to lay off a little bit.
I think so. Yeah. And actually, I think statistically in the last, I don't know, year or so, David's brought it up more than I have.
Still not his best, though. Anyway, you asked me how I'm doing. I've actually been feeling rather run down because pretty much all of January, our entire household has been sick with something. Yeah. I think we've had several rounds of things. So I'm actually on vacation today. I'm having Friday off, Monday off, Tuesday off. I'm going to use it to get a little more sleep, play with the kids. We're going to get ice fishing. Oh, I'm also going to Chuck E. Cheese today. So get a new round of coughs and sneezes from the lovely little children. But no, very, very much needed. One thing I did want to call out was that Serena Higgins, she sent around a Google Doc on future Inklings projects that need doing. And that's been a lot of attention on Twitter and Facebook. And it's great seeing someone basically, picking up the same thing that the Portland conference was doing and basically asking the question, what study needs to be done next?
Absolutely. Well, and I've been talking with a young scholar who's really fascinated with Joy Davidman, thinking about doing an honors thesis on Dianetics, Joy Davidman and Dianetics.
Oh my goodness.
Which features actually kind of prominently in some of the letters. Incidentally, listeners, as we're talking now in the last day of January, coming soon is volume 40 of the journal 7, Roman numeral 7, from the Wade Center. It deals with all 7 of their authors, including all the Inklings. And volume 40 has a bunch of unpublished Joy Davidman letters from 1952. I've been doing research on these for a couple of years, but Don King edited them, and they're coming out both in print and digitally. And it is really eye-opening stuff. So we're all quite excited for that. Yep, that's what's going on. Well, I'm drinking today. What are you guys drinking?
Hang on. We haven't heard from Matt yet. Matt, what have you been up to?
Oh, wait.
Other than abandoning us.
Yeah, it has been, I guess it's just been, I was in Colorado doing an annual ski trip, and this time it was extra long because we tied it with some work on the front end, both Mary Margaret and I, in Denver. So we went to Denver, then we took the bus over to Colorado, did a little skiing. It was a blast. It was actually, this is great. You guys will appreciate this. This is what I should talk about. I didn't really think about this. It was so cool. Mary Margaret's fantastic at skiing. Surprised me to the upside. She hasn't really ever skied. Apparently, I was like, man, babe, you have such determination. She's like, I heard an episode where you said you need your wife to be a great skier.
Oh, wow.
So apparently it was a previous episode that I had said before I think I met her.
Oh, my gosh.
And because for me, skiing has been, obviously, guys, that was never a deal breaker at all. But it was something that I've done since 2.5, 3 years old. My family went to skiing once to twice every year. So I'm quite up there in abilities. And I go with my college roommate the last 6 years, the same spot. We ski hard. So it has been obviously something I have always had as a wish to be able to do that and teach my kids at 2, 3, 4 years old and do something similar. So it really meant a lot. And it was really impressive how incredible she was, to be honest. I think she looked like she was 3 or 4 years into it based on determination.
Better than you deserve.
That's exactly correct.
Speaking of deserving things, what are you drinking?
So I am doing the West Coast IPA from Best Day Brewing.
And I am doing the Brute IPA round of cheers. What about you, Matt?
I just have coffee, to be blunt. I'm a little bit boring today because I have a lot of work right after this. I'm just drinking caffeine.
Even non-alcoholic beer, just not taking the risk.
Exactly right.
Well, in the absence of a patron supporter, Greta Gerwig's Narnia movie has officially been announced that it's going to be releasing in IMAX in Thanksgiving 2026. It's going to stream on Netflix at Christmas. And producer Amy Pascal, she says it will be, quote, all about rock and roll, which is scaring a lot of people, but I am still somewhat hopeful. No, I'm not. I'm hopeful. So let's toast to Greta Gerwig. Greta, please don't mess this up.
Cheers.
And Amy, cheers.
And Amy, cheers.
Oh, wait, I have a quote for our toast for Narnia.
Oh,
Mr.
okay.
Beaver stuck to beer.
And so on to my 100-word chapter summary of chapter 13. Ransom pursues the unmanned further out at sea. He sees mermen beneath the water eating seaweed, so Ransom tries some, but it makes him feel confused and overwhelmed. Ransom then hears the voice of Weston, who seems to have regained control of his body. Although he is confused and rants at some length, Ransom attempts to interject, but without much success. Weston then hears the sounds of waves breaking and is terrified of being dashed to death on the rocks. Ransom pleads with him to ask God for forgiveness, but Weston grabs him and drags him down into the depths.
Dun, 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 dun.
This is intense.
It really is.
It is indeed, and you weren't even here when we had the chapter about all the fighting.
Did he, just before jumping into this, just to set a little bit of context, so is it safe to say because I had such a different memory. Obviously, I didn't record in depth with you guys here, so I did go through the chapter, but admittedly, I was listening to it on audiobook. He failed with the punching, essentially. Like, I always think I had in the back of my head that he successfully just kills him, but he didn't. The Mortal Kombat, he discerned that he needed to do that, but it just didn't work. And then the pursuit happens, which is where we are now, picking up in this chapter. So then, do we think, and I'm not trying to jump ahead here now, I just was kind of recapping, is this darkness descending like he did what he could, but he actually failed and now God's going to step in?
Can you keep a secret?
Yeah.
So can I.
That's a good one, Andrew. I've never heard that.
You could try the other way. Can you keep a secret?
Yeah.
No, you answered the other way. Can you keep a secret?
No.
I can. So what happens is he realizes that he's called to fight. He's not called to have an outcome. He's called to do the struggle, even the physical struggle. And so he wakes up at peace. He gets some rest. He eats, he showers and everything. And he realizes, okay, God's got no man on this planet except for me. I'm the one who is here to do what I can do. And I'm probably going to get defeated. And then that key moment is when he fights and engages with Weston, he thinks that he's going to be fighting against demonically superior power, but he's just fighting against another kind of flabby, middle-aged intellectual. And then pretty soon realizes that he can get the upper hand. He's in a little bit better shape.
His boxing.
When he starts really, beating the crap out of him, and they're beating each other, sure. But as we find out in this chapter, he breaks his leg. And so once Weston or Unman realizes that Ransom's probably going to be able to finish the job, he runs away, which catches him a little bit off guard. And that's why Weston gets the lead. And that's where we find ourselves today. How's that, David?
I think that's great. And speaking of great, the opening line to this chapter is just beautiful. Darkness fell upon the waves as suddenly as if it had been poured out of a bottle. And so as darkness closes in, Ransom, he begins to concentrate on the sounds, which are the beating of the fish's fins and the water. And he then starts noticing more and more his own aching body. And he somehow falls asleep. And when he realizes that he's falling asleep, he decides to actually lie down on the fish to reduce his chances of falling off. And there's another great line here. We're told that a strange, thrilling sensation crept over him, communicated doubtless from the movement of the fish's muscles. It gave him the illusion of sharing in its strong bestial life, as if he were himself becoming a fish.
You know what's interesting? This is completely no spiritual or theological point. That book that I'm reading, that Fourth Imperium, that wing book that I guys told you about, maybe a month and a half ago, I finished book 1 and now I'm on book 2. Really enjoyable. If you've read Red Rising, it's practically Red Rising in a different format. Long story short, they kind of bond. These riders do with dragons. They kind of become one. I was thinking about that. Completely random, non-necessary thought, but there you go.
Okay. Thank you.
Taylor, cut all that out. After some time, he sort of has this sort of dreamlike experience, and this happens quite a lot. I'm assuming it's just because he's exhausted. Ransom finds himself staring into something that looks like a human face. Matt, what's he looking at and how does he respond to it?
I interpret it as like they like if I had to put it in an earthly sense, like these mermen.
Mm-hmm.
But more importantly, I thought they were sort of demonically possessed.
Mm-mm.
But I might have been wrong there because they were eating something that was very different and it didn't taste good. And it made me think of like when he was dissecting the frog, it came across a little bit diabolical. And then when he tasted the food and the food was bad, it really made me think this was diabolical. So that
Wow.
was that you, David? That was good.
That was me.
That's
Okay.
the sense that I got.
Okay, I'm ringing in.
All right.
I'm ringing in. I'd like to try.
Okay.
So what happens is, and this is very reminiscent of what happens several years later, he realizes that the Venusian, the Perelandrian planet, has more than just the society of the man and the woman and the animals. And so he sees other kind of humanoid, merman type creatures under the water. And this is almost exactly what happens to Lucy at the end of the voyage of the Dawn Treader. Again, another planet. Ta-da! And so another planet with an oceanic life, and not angry at them, just neutral. And so Lucy kind of connects with a young girl who's a fish herder in Dawn Treader. Here, though, bizarrely, when he sees the dude eating something, Ransom scoops some up and eats it. And I love the fact that at the end of when he decides to kind of hold off, in spite of his hunger, he threw the rest of the weed away. I thought that was a very contemporaneous word for Lewis to use. It's almost like LSD. Although this is before LSD and before the prevalence of drug use. But when he eats it, he starts to kind of hallucinate. There's also a relation to when the children get to Narnia and breathe in Narnian air, they get stronger. So the atmosphere of the planet itself will invigorate or will have some effects. So he is kind of at that point of one part of Perelandra.
Or since we're talking about planets, influence might be a really good word.
Influence. By the way, when we say somebody has the flu, it comes from the Latin word influenza, but that literally means I can't explain this infection. I don't have science for it. And so it's the influence of the planets. So the flu was originally assigned to the influence of the planets or the stars. So that's what the medievals thought that the flu was.
I assign it to the grubby children that my children play with.
Yes, absolutely.
This isn't good. First bat up after being benched for a couple weeks, and I just botch it.
You benched yourself, dude. You kicked yourself out of the game, man.
I struck out. Yes, listeners, by the way, this is all one big joke.
I do want to mention about the category of creatures that these are. And Joseph Weigel from the Men with Chess podcast, he's spoken a lot about this category of creature. And in the sequel to Perelandra, That Hideous Strength, we're going to hear them described as neutrals. And the descriptions that are given of these people, because this is not the first time he's met these mermen, they're described as neither bestial nor diabolic, but merely elvish, out of our orbit. So they're not humans, they're not animals, they're not angels. And Lewis, in different places, he refers to them as Longivi, or elves, fairies, elementals. And that elementals reference, that's actually a reference to St. Paul's letter to the Colossians, where he talks about the elemental spirits. And so if you want to learn more about this, Joseph just did a couple of episodes on That Hideous C.S. Lewis podcast, and he's got a book coming out called Planet Vulcandra, which will go into this in great depth.
Yeah. Longivi, by the way, is a Latin word for the long livers or the long age, right? Long ivy, like medieval, middle age, middle period. And Lewis kind of seems to, it's his universe is more than just binary. It's not just angels and demons and humans. It's, these neutrals, these other forces. And that's kind of a breadth of a worldview that a lot of the medievals had. And Lewis is at least exploring the possibility of some of that.
What did you make of the comments about the mermen and Ransom being irrelevant to each other and out of each other's orbits?
Yeah, I kind of thought it's just this planetary structure. I mean, there are other things happening in the planet that don't necessarily relate to the king and the queen. And he says maybe this, this anthropomorphic idea of a king and a queen is just wrong. But maybe they only had a local reign rather than a global reign.
Yeah, I just sort of saw it as like they're just separate stories. It's not the A plot, but there are B plots going alongside.
I wonder if maybe the Inklings fell asleep at this point and didn't say, and should have said, "Oh, Jack, leave all that off. That doesn't push the plot along." But I like them. It's kind of like Tolkien liking Hobbit talk, because this trope, I mean, he returns to it, and he uses that again in the Narnia.
And just before we leave the section, I do want to mention a little bit more about the food and the effect that it has on him. I didn't regard it as a hallucinogen, more of the fact that it pushed Ransom more into their perspective. We talk about you are what you eat. We talk about the Eucharist, that we receive Christ and we become Christ. There's something about receiving this weed puts him into their worldview, their perspective, in much the same way that the food on the floating islands and the static land has helped shape his own viewpoint as he's interacted with the creatures above ground from Perelandra. And he actually says that he almost makes it feel like he's in a myth again. There's almost even a slight echo of the silver chair in terms of when the children are taken underground, it's now suddenly a very different world. And as the Green Lady is doing her magic, it's starting to close off the world that they knew before. And so in the same way, Ransom, like Puddleglum, he resists that because he knows what's important.
I think it's a bit of a plot hole, though, that Lewis misses. I mean, so he stops eating the weed, but he has been hours, maybe even the better part of a day between sleeping and waking, and he hasn't eaten anything, right? There's nothing else for him to eat this whole time.
Well, we're told that Ransom must have fallen asleep again because he wakes in daylight, and he realizes a few things, worrying things, that give him a little pause for thought. The birds that were following them before, they've gone away. He actually sees one of the fish leave their party and who's just had enough. And Ransom really seems to really strike him the sense of scale on Perelandra, and realizing that he's not guaranteed any more floating islands. It would be like if you started swimming eastwards from Washington, D.C. You're not actually guaranteed land. There might be a whole lot of ocean before you reach Europe.
Oh, way to work in my hometown.
You see what I did there?
It becomes an occasion of doubt. And one of the things I loved about this chapter is that it's almost like another chapter or a couple chapters of Screwtape. It really is an analysis of the psychology of temptation. Now that the enemy can't beat Ransom physically, now that he can't quite outrun him, now he's causing him doubts about things, and he's trying to find any way to make him less effective. And it almost succeeds.
And once again, we're learning the lesson that temptation and attack can come when you're tired and hungry.
Yes.
So have a snack and take a nap.
Hungry, angry, lonely, and tired. Halt and do something about it.
He starts to wonder, well, given the sense of scale of this planet, are the king and queen really the king and queen? And he has all kinds of doubts. The sense of scale seems to really, really invade his mind. It's sort of like the atheistic argument about the universe. It's like, what makes you think that human beings are so special given the vastness of the universe? Do you really think it's likely that there's a God who actually cares for you? Regardless of whatever the future of mankind actually holds, because we don't know how long we're going to have, and who knows? There might be life on other planets despite what Jack wanted.
Yeah. And again, it's another form of temptation. It's another form of dissuasion. But, he's done a fairly good job at least paying attention to that and evading all of those.
Then, after some time, Ransom is roused from his daydreams and thoughts by a human voice, and specifically it's the unman's. Matt, how would you assess the unman's state at this point in time?
At first, I mean, it's an evolving state, first and foremost, but at first he comes across, and I actually, as I'm more speaking from the reader's perspective, it seems that he is back to Weston. He's confused. He's like, where have I been? What's going on? I've been beaten up. I'm broken. I'm not in good shape right now. But really quickly, you do question, is this incredibly uncanny, diabolical mind twist? Or is it authentic? And to be honest, it becomes a little bit more clear, I think, later what it evolves into. But at that moment, I still don't know. I mean, it was incredibly convincing. I mean, if you asked me, is it convincing enough? I'd say that was Weston.
And it certainly sounds like him. It's not dissimilar to their breaks between their fights, the almost perfectly timed rounds. And they seem to be kind of taking a break and catching their breath.
The amazing thing is he even apologizes. He said, we've had our quarrels. I know. I'm sorry. I was like, wait, Weston is apologizing?
Yeah.
He says, I dare say I've been wrong.
Do you think that as much as that is Weston, that the diabolical possession of him, that demons or whatever is making that happen, is allowing him to come back knowing he's going to act this way because it's going to create sympathy, and he has a host that he'll be able to take back in a second. So even though it's maybe truly Weston, it's still not like truly Weston in the sense that this is completely being permitted by the demon in that moment because he knows it will garner sympathy. He knows it's a strategy for the long game, lose this little mini battle to win the war. Do you think that's true? Or
I'd say so. I think the unman is using Weston as bait. It's like he can't escape. All right, let's get him to come near me, and then we'll see what happens.
Yeah, because he switches quickly.
The phrase is interesting because in Studies in Words late in his life, Lewis has a whole chapter 11, on the phrase, I dare say, which may mean, for all I know to the contrary, it may mean probably, or I shouldn't be surprised if, I shouldn't wonder if. And so even using this phrase, there's a little bit of equivocation here.
And the thing I would actually present as my argument for why I do think it's Weston, what he says. Ransom, it said again in a broken voice, for God's sake, speak to me.
Mm-hmm.
So he's invoking God, and I don't think that's something that the unman would probably do.
Right. And also, there's another echo of Silver Chair, right? The first person who asks you to do anything in Aslan's name. And so these are not just imprecations. These are not just him swearing. Literally, it means for God's sake.
Well, as I mentioned, all the fish are now gone, except for the ones that Weston and Ransom are riding.
Slowly.
Yes, very slowly. They're tired. And when Weston discovers that his spacecraft is almost certainly lost, he's absolutely terrified at the thought of being stuck on Perelandra. And the text even says he starts crying like a baby. Andrew, is this the pastoral care that you would offer somebody if they were terrified of death?
I may maybe choose, something a little bit more uplifting than that.
It could be worse.
Buck up. It's only death, all said and done. We shall all die someday, we shan't lack water, right? There's a certain amount, especially and I just passed last Saturday, I celebrated my second year of being a priest, and we had 19 funerals at our church last year. And in this last week, lost 2 longtime parishioners. May God rest their souls. I'm having a more kind of longer view of death as, okay, this is something that happens in one's life. I know an individual death for everybody is incredibly difficult. I still grieve my father's death more than 10 years ago. Nevertheless, it is a part of life. It is kind of something one can resign oneself to. It's what Lewis says in Learning in Wartime. It's the attitude in Screwtape Letters as well. And it's the kind of thing that Lewis kind of came to terms with. And so he's trying to say, hey, let's not pretend death isn't going to happen. If death is going to happen, let's do something wise about it. He says something similar to the American Lady, to Mary Willis Shelburne. Right? It's rather solemn fun. The train is soon to leave the station. I wonder who will get there first. And so he's using what St. Francis called sister death to even try to encourage him to make a right choice before he dies. This chapter was one of the first ones where I really realized that part of Lewis's technique in reflecting the glory of God is to give everybody a last chance. And one last chance, if they'll accept it, happens in that hideous strength as well.
Now, Weston's getting kind of desperate, and he makes Ransom promise that he won't leave him, which is kind of hilarious considering everything that's gone down between the two of them. And then Weston asks where it is, clearly referring to the unman. And Ransom actually flips back on him and asks him if he knows. And also he asks him, where do you think you've been for the past few days? And then Weston says something weird, and we're sort of going to head into this next major section of dialogue. And I have had to reread this several times because I think there are quite a lot of things that are not explicitly said. Because Weston suddenly says, it's all true, What's he talking about?
the sense that there's the spiritual, but we already kind of had that prior to this. So I think the new revelation is the fact that he believes there is a God. So he's gotten a step closer. Like, notice his evolution from the Weston that we met in on the Silent Planet to this Weston. It's been getting closer and closer. And I remember we had this conversation maybe 6, 7, 8 chapters ago where he actually now started believing in the spiritual, but he didn't understand. He thought there was no distinction between good and evil, really. Now he's like recognizing there's a God, but he has some like unique logic of this God, but you're all going to fall into the evil camp. And I thought he was speaking here a little bit more about like hell, which is why he's afraid right now. Maybe he wouldn't use that language of hell per se, but there's a God, but we're just naturally going away from him. That's the sense that I got. What do you think, Andrew?
Well, I wonder if maybe it's a little bit like, and there are folks certainly in my own communion and others who say, well, I believe in God, I just don't believe in a devil. What's happening here in the middle of the century, at the turn of the century, the 20th century, people stopped believing in God. I'm overgeneralizing vastly, but they didn't believe in a God, or they believed in a God, but not in a personal devil or anything. And that's all mythology, that's all made up. But mostly they just kind of cast it out. Christianity must be false. It's the path that Lewis trod. And then Weston is finding out that there is a life force, but now he's finding out there is a death force. And the enemy is trying to convince him of a spirituality that's entirely negative. And once again, he's counterfeiting, he's twisting. And even Ransom almost falls for it. And so it's all true. Well, he doesn't believe all of it yet, because if he did, I don't want to give it away, but, he says, oh, there's only death and and all of this. And even as Ransom falls for it, I'm like, but Jesus died, right? Jesus went through that and then didn't stop. He'd been to all those depths. That's what happened on Holy Saturday when he harrowed hell. But that wasn't the end of the story. And so it's kind of like the Freud and Lewis movie. Lewis read as much as Freud did, and Freud stopped there, and Lewis carried on until he found the resurrected Christ, and that's what he based his life on. So it's all true, but he doesn't know all of it yet. If he did, he'd believe.
Yeah, I do think basically in the process of his possession, he has effectively been sort of dragged down. He's had a foretaste of hell. So he's experienced death in a way, and also suffering. And he says, it's all very well for you, Ransom. Drowning doesn't hurt and death is bound to come anyway and all that nonsense. What do you know about death? It's all true, I tell you. He's basically saying, I've experienced something of this. Mm-hmm. And he seems to regret his life choices. He says, I keep trying to persuade myself to make, that it matters if something happens to the human race. Mm-hmm. That can make the world better, but it's just all rot.
Well, David, we can maybe phrase this slightly differently too. He's having evolution. What's the part that's like new to him right here? Prior to this moment, even before when he thought there was a spiritual, he still placed his emphasis on trying to help humankind. Now, in a massively perverted way, but his goal was to keep humanity going, to do interspace travel, to do all this stuff. And now he's like, well, that doesn't matter. We're all going to die. This doesn't matter. So there is that part too that's just gone. Now, what he hasn't woken up to is exactly what Andrew was saying, is the wisdom of death yet, that Saturday, when you just sent in and Christ came through it. But he's now at least at a point where it's like, he's almost kind of in that nihilistic phase. None of this really matters on earth. There's nothing we can really do. We're all going to die.
Well, and remember what Mere Christianity says, out of ourselves into Christ we must go. And so all that he has been believing and thinking about, the life force and everything else, has been about himself. And then when he finds that that's all ending in death, right, then he thinks that that's the ultimate reality. But death isn't the ultimate reality. The White Witch fell for it just like Satan fell for it. Oh, maybe if I kill the Son of God, then that'll make things all right. But even death is undone, right? Has no victory, has no sting, right? And this is something that Weston hasn't come to grips with yet, that even death, because he thinks of death as the annihilation of himself, and he's still thinking about himself. It doesn't even begin to cross his mind. Maybe my death would make the life of the king and the queen better on this planet and I'll stop tormenting them. Maybe my death would pay for something good. But the entire structure of Judeo-Christianity says that death leads us into better life, right? And so he's, of course, the enemy's not going to let him think anything like that.
Yeah, he doesn't know about the deeper magic. He thinks this is where it ends. This is why he says that the thing that's truer is a child that sees a dead body and then has horrible nightmares, or children being afraid to walk through churchyards, or strange ceremonies in Africa, or priests in Ireland talking about, hell and death and destruction. It's like, that's it. That's everything. That's the totality. And so he therefore thinks the only good is to live for as long as you can. And through this entire section, I kept thinking of the Sadducees, who in Jesus' time, they denied the resurrection of the dead. That's why they were sad, you see. Here's what Weston says. That's why it's so important to live as long as you can. All good things are now a thin little rind of what we call life, put on for show, and then the real universe forever and ever. To thicken the rind by 1 centimeter, to live 1 week, 1 day, 1/2 hour longer. That's the only thing that matters. And it says, of course you can't know it, but every man who has been waiting to be hanged knows it. You might say, what difference does a short brief make? What a difference. And just in that section, you'll see so many of those things reappear in that hideous strength about trying to gain some other kind of extended life, even for, say, a convicted criminal. I won't say any more if people haven't read it.
And he says, they've taken off my head.
Yes.
Given this specific section here, we should offer our next common room. And I think this could be really interesting, and our listeners, you guys might enjoy this. We should watch that Brian Johnson documentary on Netflix. He's the Do Not Die guy, and he's the one that essentially he sold Venmo for like $800 million, and he spends $2 to $3 million a year optimizing his life and trying to come up with breakthroughs, and thinks AI and biology plus super health is going to, I don't think he truly thinks you're not going to die, but like get to 130, 140, 150. And I've actually messaged him a little bit on Twitter. He doesn't respond, obviously, because just a different philosophical worldview. And there's nothing wrong with trying to live healthy and trying to optimize your life and live as healthy as long as you can. But if that's the end goal,
it depends on why. Yeah, it's exactly what you're saying. Why are we doing it? Yeah.
So anyway, it'd be really interesting for us to watch that, I guess. And my buddy watched it. There's a lot in it, and it sounds just like this, which is why I'm obviously bringing this up, and we could just all talk about it for 30 minutes.
Ransom then has a very strange line. He says, but nobody need go there. They haven't actually spoken about a place, not explicitly. What's he talking about?
I think it's hell.
Or at the very least, the grave, like Sheol, Hades, the pagan place of the dead, where it's sort of like shady and is like not particularly great, but meh.
Well, as Lewis said in his best book, die before you die, there is no time after. Right?
I was saving that for later. Oh.
Okay, it wasn't me, listeners. It wasn't me. But yeah, this attitude that even death is a door, right? And a door into, into all things that are great. And so it need not be the final death.
What happens when Ransom tries to bring up the subject of God?
Well, typically he cherry picks from the Bible. He perverts it,
cleverly too, to be blunt.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
The enemy's always twisting the scriptures. He's the God of the living, not the dead, not of the dead. And that's where I wrote in the margin of my book. He's also the God of the dead. He also experienced dead. So he's picking what he wants, and he's turning a blind eye to the most important thing is the death, the burial, resurrection, and ascension of our Lord. And he's just not paying attention to that or pretending that it doesn't even exist.
Well, it's funny that I mentioned the Sadducees earlier, because this is the Sadducee passage where Jesus refutes them. And the entire point of the passage is that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are alive.
That's a good one, too.
That is why God is God of the living. That it doesn't just end with death.
I never thought about it. Well done, W.
Well, and I think what we see here portrayed fictively is the scripture that says the last enemy is death. And so this is the last enemy that they're fighting right before we find out Weston's fate.
There's a really interesting line where Weston is sharing his thoughts on God. Basically that God is out of time, but is now not used as an explanation to try and understand God better. It's the fact that he's fine. He's out there. We're the ones sort of sinking below the surface into the grave. And he says, God doesn't follow us there. But this is the Christian message that God did follow us there.
Yes. And that was the beginning of everything, not the end of everything. And Lewis says at the end of Mere Christianity, submit with all your being to the death of your wishes, and submit to death in the end, and you will find life. Because death is the great enemy in, modernist science in the 40s and 50s. The biological end is just the worst part. And that's what Weston's embodying, but we know more than that.
Mm. And speaking of mere Christianity, that's actually what Ransom does next. He pulls out a mere Christianity argument. When Weston is saying that, there's nothing but death and destruction, he says, well, that could hardly be the whole story, because if the whole universe were like that, since we're part of it, we'd feel at home in such a universe. Mm-hmm. The very fact that it strikes us as monstrous. So he's sort of doing a mixture of the argument from morality and the internal feeling that something about this is wrong, as well as the argument from desire, the hope chapter in Mere Christianity, saying that this clearly tells us that it points towards another world. But Ransom doesn't actually get to unpack this argument, because Weston seems to then start denying the realness of reality. It's basically like everything's meaningless. True, false, real, unreal. That only makes sense while you're alive. As soon as you're dead, you're dead.
Right.
That you move to a very different sort of reality. And Ransom points out that, well, if you're basically saying everything's futile, what's the point in expressing the position? And Weston does seem to sort of lean into it. It's like, yep, no point in anything. We're all going to die.
But that's another Mere Christianity argument, because and stay with me, if there was no meaning, then the statement that there is no meaning would itself be meaningless. In fact, if there isn't any meaning, if the universe is meaningless, then one of the things in the universe that is meaningless is the idea of meaninglessness. And two negatives make a positive. So if the world is meaningless and the statement that the world is meaningless, that means that the universe is meaningful. And that's the argument that Lewis takes readers down in Mere Christianity, and he's trying to get Weston to see, but it may be too late.
And he sort of gives a line that's later going to come in The Magician's Nephew, that how one views the universe depends on one's perspective, basically what philosophy one is bringing to it.
Yes.
How one is looking at it. And it seems that Weston's perspective is just very hellish. He says, all it matters is, are you dead or are you alive? It's like, he says that everything can look great on the outside, the shape of a body, a planet, but what's on the inside? Darkness, worms, heat, pressure, salt, suffocation, and sink.
And it's that quote from Magician's Nephew, what you see and hear. No, it's at the end of The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. What you see and hear depends. Magician's Nephew?
Yeah, during the creation.
Right. But
what you see and hear depends where you're standing and what sort of person you are.
I thought that was great. I thought that was when Eustace is talking about how the sun is a ball of gas. And he said, even in your world, it's not only that's only what it's made of. It's not what it is. Mm-hmm. And what you see and hear depends a great deal on what sort of person you are, and also depends on where you're standing.
I think you're conflating two quotations.
I may be that's very typical of me, and I've learned better than to argue with you when you're right.
It took me 3 years to learn that.
It has not made at all the same impression on him as on the cabin and on the children. For what you see and hear depends a good deal on where you're standing. It also depends on what sort of person you are.
Absolutely.
What I have learned is, if you have conviction, push back against David once or twice. If he's very strong firming, he's 98% right.
Well, yeah. My wife actually just finished reading The Magician's Nephew again, because she's doing a book club with one of the sisters-in-law. And she then got carried away. They're just doing it on The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And so, needless to say, a few nights later, my wife has now nearly finished the entire season, the entire series.
You also married well.
Oh, yes. Although she often keeps the light on when I want to go to sleep, but that's okay. I offer it up for her sins.
Wow.
Oh, yeah. Weston then, he's kind of sulky. He says that Ransom doesn't care, and that Weston he's been below the rind, which again, it lends credence to this idea that he has experienced something of the afterlife in this possession. He's experienced something of death and of hell, but Ransom hasn't yet. And he says that, he talks about this dream where he's made up nice looking for his funeral, but basically we're all worm food in the end. And once again, Ransom offers some pastoral care by telling him to shut up. Weston then goes on to talk about spiritualism. What's his take on spiritualism? This surprised me.
You know, he has a run on it, and he talks about ectoplasm and slimy films coming out of a medium's belly and making great chaotic tumble-down faces, automatic writing. I think there's a little influence from Charles Williams there, because Williams is interested in all that kind of magic stuff.
But I think his point is the fact that it's not nice. Reaching into the afterworld is not angels and harps and fluffy clouds. You know, it's dark and depressing and gross.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
But he also, like, I didn't really understand what he would say. Like, if you were diving a little bit deeper with him, because he almost does acknowledge there is some sort of good, but you're just automatically moving away from it. Like, the closest you experience it is now, and it only gets darker and darker and darker and darker as time goes on. And so it'd be interesting to ask someone with that worldview, what was the point of the good? You know, how did it get here? Is there, you know, why is this automatic? Is there no free? Like, I was thinking some of those thoughts, and maybe Lewis isn't trying to do that. Maybe he's just trying to show a person's progression and the fact that it is illogical and it won't make sense, to be blunt, because it's not ultimate truth. Yeah, I thought it was interesting.
Well, and I love the fact that he says you wouldn't understand, that great Germanic word, meaning you wouldn't be able to stand under it. And he has gone under the surface, but he has not gone all the way down to the dregs and then come back again with life in his hands.
I like that. I've never heard someone phrase it that way.
Our Andrew has a way with words.
Well, let's hope.
Well, his companion calls out because he's heard something, and Ransom listens, but he can't identify it. And as the waves and the winds grow, Weston starts to panic. "Oh my God," he cried. "Oh, Ransom, we should be killed and put back under the rind. Ransom, you promised to help me. Don't let them get me again." So he thinks he's going to be smashed to pieces on rocks. And then he says, "Oh God, here comes the dark." And the dark came. Horror of death such as he had never known. Horror of the terrified creature at his side descended upon Ransom. Finally, horror with no definite object. All kind of sounds rather like the Dark Island from Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Apparently it's on Perelandra as well.
I was thinking that. Great minds think alike, not just a hat rack.
How does Ransom try to offer Weston some hope?
I love that. I you know, and this is one of my favorites. This was in contention for a quote of the week. And this is, you know, kind of a big part of my Lewisian theology. "Are you there, Weston?" he shouted. "What cheer? Pull yourself together. All that stuff you're talking is lunacy. Say a child's prayer if you can't say a man's," right? Any kind of prayer is enough to start on the way. Repent your sins. Take my hand. There are hundreds of mere boys on earth facing death this moment. That's from Screwtape and Mere Christianity and all the rest. But then I love the last thing he says. We'll do very well. There's even an internal pun in it, or a rhyme. And he says of Weston, who's been trying to kill him and destroy this planet and is demon-possessed, we, right? It's like the Our Father or the we in the Nicene Creed. He is trying to create community with him.
Or the Us Lions.
Us Lions, yes. And he's trying to offer him some community that is not just this enemy trying to destroy him. And he's giving him one last chance, which God always does.
The other thing I'll say too here is this, obviously, our listeners will know, really echoes the idea of the Great Divorce, where we will be near the end, we're going to realize we were all sort of wrong to some degree. Throw up your hands. I mean, some of us might have understood and surrendered to reality better than others, but it's unlikely that any of us really surrendered to it perfectly or understood it perfectly. And therefore, there is this point of just like, all the stuff you've been talking is lunacy. You know, just kind of say that, repent and surrender to what is, because you no longer really have to speculate what it's going to be. And I really did just appreciate that. And I also appreciated the second thing in this statement, will do very well. There's a confidence. I mean, notice Ransom's confidence in divine goodness, in love, in mercy. And that's really beautiful, not only for himself, which is hard enough to do. And he has, more reason to be confident in it for himself under kind of a flawed worldview. But under the appropriate worldview, he has equal the amount of confidence for someone as diabolical as Weston, if he's willing to surrender. And I think that's also quite beautiful. And that's a deep amount of faith.
Well, and we'll do very well. The past tense of that is one of the highest compliments that a Brit will ever give you. Well done. And remember a couple chapters ago, he said all of it was still before him. And so now, instead of trying to kill Weston, he's trying to save Weston with Weston's agency. And he's saying, it'll be well done. Once we finish, we will be commended. And there's even an echo of, well done, my good and faithful servant, enter into your rest. And so he's almost echoing, or maybe deliberately echoing, Jesus's lines and promising him there's this, we can get out of it and you can be all the way to heaven. I mean, I keep thinking about the thief on the cross. And if you had written his story up until 5 minutes before his death, it would have been a very different story. Mm. And he's offering him that same kind of, today you'll be with me in paradise that our Lord offered to the thief.
And trying to get him to snap out of where he is, because he says, you've been talking lunacy. You've been speaking as though you are living in the realm of the lunar realm of those under the influence of the devil on earth.
And they are translunar. They are translunar. They have crossed the boundary, and that's a huge boundary in the medieval period. And so he is outside of the influence of the moon. Perelandra doesn't have a moon, according to, at least in this iteration of it. So, yeah, there's a possibility.
So he tries to draw him out of that, but then Weston grabs him. Let go. What the devil are you doing? And as he spoke, strong arms had plucked him from the saddle of his fish, had wrapped him round in a terrible embrace just below his thighs, so a rugby tackle, and clutching uselessly at the smooth surface of the fish's body, Ransom was dragged down. The waters closed over his head, and still his enemy pulled him down into the warm depth, and down further yet to where it was no longer warm. What a way to end a chapter. Great.
I am so intrigued with the next chapter, and I have not read ahead, obviously, because I'm being disciplined and really want to, but I'm obviously going to wait until, next week.
Okay, it's discipline that's doing that. Is that it? Is that
that took way too long. I thought that was funnier than it was. Yeah. Anyways.
Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
I experimented a little bit with ChatGPT last night, asking about C.S. Lewis's best book.
Oh my goodness! Did you find a young person to help you?
Let me turn up my hearing aid to see if I can,
But before you answer this, because I want to make sure I understand which lens to filter us through, which ChatGPT model did you use?
I just downloaded the app on my phone.
Okay, the older one. Okay, that's helpful.
So, send me some guidance, Matt. I'm open for that. Kristen's been playing around with it too, but Lewis referred to Perelandra as his best book until after he wrote Till We Have Faces. And we know he's elsewhere said, in the cathedral of my books, Perelandra and Till We Have Faces are near the top. And so the craftsmanship of this book also impressed Lewis as he was thinking about it after writing it.
We will circle back to that ChatGPT. I hear the call for final drinks. So thanks to our intern, Julia, our sound engineers, Taylor and Sarah. Does this mean Taylor's just been expanding his team? Well done, Taylor, building a good business around this. I mean, I guess I've obviously been saying these names, but it really did start with Taylor. Then it started with Taylor and intern. Now it's Taylor, Sarah, and an intern. It's like, it's well done. Thanks to our Patreon supporters, particular top tier supporters. Jody, Robert, Mark, Mary Margaret, Rowdy, Angela, David, Peter, Kate, James, John, Sarah, Rebecca, Meg, and Brian. Joanna, Kelly, Stephen, Gary, Paul, Kay, Becca, Shane, Thomas, Amanda, Joelle, Erica, Matt, James, Bud 2, Bud 1, Edgar, Aldo, Kevin, Mark, Luke, Peter, Joseph, Ariana, Jim. No, I'm just kidding. And of course, thanks to all of you for listening. And please join us next time, and we'll continue going
further up
and further in.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers.